Hi, everyone. Welcome. Thank you so much for joining us here today. My name is Naomi Mahaffey, and I'm the facilitator of ABSI Connect, Alberta Social Innovation Connect. Our purpose is to find, connect, celebrate, and support Albertans who are creating and testing new ways of approaching complex and messy social and environmental problems. One of the ways we do that is through hosting conversations that help us think differently about the systems we're working within and the tools and pathways we use to create change. So I'm really excited to have James and Alina with us today to speak about artificial intelligence and why the social good sector should care about and help shape the role AI plays in our society. James Stauch is the director of the Institute for Community Prosperity at Mount Royal University in Calgary. He has led the creation of many education programs for students and community leaders. He's served as a foundation executive, and he's written a lot of fantastic accessible publications related to the nonprofit sector, systems thinking, social enterprise, and more. And Dr. Alina Turner is the CEO of the social enterprise Helpseeker, which is a platform designed to improve how people find, access, and coordinate social services. She's the co-founder of Turner Strategies and a fellow at the School of Public Policy at the University of Calgary. Alina previously led the implementation of Canada's first homelessness management information system, and she currently serves on various national and provincial boards. These are both people I deeply admire, and going through their full bios would take time away from this amazing presentation. So I'll just encourage you to read their full bios and check out their publications, and we'll make sure that we share out a few links in a follow-up email next week. Before I turn it over to James and Alina, a few quick housekeeping items. This session is being recorded, and you'll notice you've entered the session on mute and with your video turned off. This is just to help make sure we reduce background noise and have it be a better experience for everybody. So we ask that you stay muted during the presentation. If you have any questions, please pop them in the chat, and my colleague Elise and I will be monitoring those, and we'll ask James and Alina to respond to your questions at the end of the session, when we'll also invite you to unmute yourselves if you want to ask any questions verbally. With that said, welcome, and over to you to start us off, James.
Thanks so much, Naomi, and thank you for hosting this conversation. I think it's timely, and hopefully it'll be a lively hour. So before we get going, we're going to try a little experiment. We're going to try doing a poll with a couple of questions, just to get a sense of kind of what's the nature of people joining in, and where do you sort of locate yourself. So Elise, are you able to try and pop that up on the screen? Okay, so hopefully everyone can see just a little box that says who's here. Go ahead, and there's two questions there. One is, do you consider yourself to be working primarily in, and then either you're in tech or you're in, broadly speaking, social purpose work. Maybe you are working right at the intersection of those two, or maybe you're here just out of interest and really wouldn't associate with either of those. And then on the second question, it's just a scale of what importance do you place on AI as a public priority? One being, it's not a priority at all, it's kind of all hype and pretty exotic, and we really have more important issues to talk about. To 10, it's absolutely the most important issue we could possibly be talking about. So go ahead and do the poll, and then Elise will reveal the results. Okay, is that enough time for folks? Okay, here are the results. Okay, quite a few of you are actually doing a combination of involved in tech and social good, so that'll be interesting. And a lot of people think it's pretty important. No one thinks it's not important, which makes sense given that you signed up for the webinar. That's great. Okay, we just wanted to just test that technology out and see how it plays. So just to get us going, artificial intelligence, or AI, we think is probably the most important disruption to human social organization since the Neolithic agricultural revolution. But the vast majority of AI development is actually in realms that are not social good focused at all. They're done for commercial purposes or purposes of state surveillance and control, particularly in China. And yet the very sector charged with monitoring, advocating, improving social impact and civil discourse is barely talking about it. So I think there's an enormous opportunity here for nonprofits, for philanthropic organizations, for all kinds of social purposed entities to start paying much closer attention to AI and to look for ways to become involved. So this guy on the screen, Stanislav Petrov, he saved the world in 1983. How did he do that? Well, he identified a flaw in the algorithm falsely alerting the Soviets to an American nuclear strike. He disobeyed orders from the Soviet military command, which would have otherwise ushered in essentially the end of civilization. So this is a cautionary tale about our faith in technology, just as a background theme. So we fast forward about 3 decades and we find the head of Oxford's Future of Humanity Institute, Nick Bostrom, warning that, again, we are like small children playing with a bomb. But here he's referring not to nuclear weapons, but instead to the rise of artificial intelligence. So we've had a lot of headline grabbers over the past few years that are kind of in that apocalyptic vein. You have Elon Musk saying AI is actually summoning the demon. We have Henry Kissinger coming out of the woodwork. It might be a bit rich, but he's warning that that we may be actually going down a path with killer robots, self-learning killing machines that we need to get on top of. But in fact, there is another side to the AI story. And so here's one from just a couple weeks ago. Canadian health monitoring program Blue Dot, founded by U of T researcher Cameron Kahn, alerted its customers of the Wuhan coronavirus outbreak a full 9 days before the World Health Organization notified the public. So to achieve this foresight, Blue Dot's AI algorithm combs through foreign language news reports, animal plant disease networks, official proclamations to pinpoint a potential outbreak. And then this, just a few days ago, Edmonton Police Department launched a new initiative that will use amalgamated data, AI, and machine learning to combat crime in the city. They call it the Community Solutions Accelerator, which surely is both a social innovation and an example of, I would call it systems-led leadership. And it's going to focus on the interconnected challenges underpinning criminal activity, addictions, homelessness, mental health. So as Police Chief Dale McPhee points out, I think courageously, he says, we cannot continue to do things the same way and expect a different outcome. We need to think differently, act differently, and take some risks if we want to see real results for the vulnerable people in the community. So before we dive into our own exploration, just a little bit of background on what led us to this. So the Institute for Community Prosperity works to ensure that students have access to high impact, immersive, current learning to improve and transform communities. Our interest in AI and its implications for either harming or helping social good actually came out of some future scanning work that we do each of the past 4 years on behalf of or for the client, the Calgary Foundation as a client. And there we look at a broad suite of social, economic, environmental, technological trends, controversies. And the last report, the 2019 report, we included a small section on AI. And as I looked into it, it really piqued my curiosity. I couldn't shake just how important this issue seemed to be, and yet how obscure and off the radar it was in the social sector. That is until I met with Alina Turner, who was already utilizing machine learning algorithms for her work, looking at human service systems and large-scale social change. So I'll pass things over to Alina at this point.
Yeah, thanks, James. And you can flip over to the next slide too. And hi, everyone. Just a little bit about my role and how James and I connected. So some of you might know me from the social service sector because I used to work in the homeless serving sector for quite a number of years, and immigrant and civil society type of organizations. One of the biggest challenges that I found working in those service-oriented organizations is that we kept coming up over and over again against key systems challenges and coordination and integration challenges. So the sector has ballooned quite quickly and has become really, really tough to navigate. So one of the kind of solutions that I took on is to leverage the power of technology and helping us think differently about how to coordinate the sector and to bring that user experience to shape how the sector is structured. So we ended up founding a social enterprise. It's a B Corp. I don't know if you guys know much about B Corps, but I'm sure this is the right audience to talk about social enterprises too. And so the focus of the B Corp, and the name of it is Helpseeker, is to positively disrupt the social service safety net and try to transform it into something that's more person-centered and innovative, leveraging technology and other systems transformation tools. So one of the first products that we launched is the systems navigation apps, and you can see kind of a quick screenshot of what that looks like, and you can download it and play with it and all of that. But the front end is meant to help that user journey to the right service. On the back end, though, because we map services and assets in the community, we're now able to generate some very interesting ecosystem data to start analyzing for opportunities for change that are much more nuanced than what we used to have in the sector. So flip to the next one too, because this is where the AI piece comes in. And those of you that are in the tech space, you know that a search bar is not just a search bar. It's a very complex kind of example of where we can put that machine learning to good use. So this is just a screenshot of the app, and you can see there that it's I typed in ad and it starts auto-generating like addictions or listings or locations, etc. And the point of that is, like, we just introduced that about 5 months ago. It's a really tiny thing in the platform, but the back end is constantly learning from those user interactions to better understand the user's journey and how people's mental models are actually expressed when it comes to looking for assistance, and whether it's mental health, addictions, homelessness, etc. I might start typing in addictions, but I end up clicking on a food bank service, for instance. Well, the algorithm is constantly, like, there's constant kind of adaptation and learning along the way. And then for me, from a systems change perspective, I need to understand all of these interactions when it comes to systems planning and integration as a whole, especially when we're talking about 100,000 different services. So all those dots that you see behind on the map, those all represent multiple services, and what does all of that tell us about the future of this work. So we now are at this precipice of the data coming in, the machine learning is in place, and now it's taking us in a very, very different direction than it would have happened even a year ago. So I'm experiencing this firsthand, running this shop, and then I'm asking these deeper questions around the ethics of, to what degree do we track individuals through this? Do we monetize the data from personal information, right? Like all these very, very critical questions that are shaping how the technology is being developed. So for instance, in Helpseeker, we made a decision not to track through kind of user protected mechanisms at all. So we don't know the unique individuals, and we constantly get asked, well, how many of them were Indigenous and how many of them were, we don't need to know that to give them the right experience. But that was a business decision that shaped how the technology was developed, that was more kind of morally and values informed. That's not necessarily how business is done elsewhere, as we'll see shortly. So this was really the birth of this partnership with James to start probing how AI's use in the social good space can drive the conversation further. And the beginning of our work together was in this paper, and we really started with the research and starting to think through, what are the big questions in this space, and how does it all fit in with what we're doing in the social purpose field. So we had this report that, here's another plug for the report. We have it linked as well on ABSE's sign up for this, and fill your boots. This is kind of like our thinking, and funny enough, some of it is already out of date, James, because the sector is moving so quickly, but at least it raises some of these key points. So flip to the next one too, please. Yeah. So a bit of a quote from us, another plug as well. We don't need to spend our time reading it. There we go. The philanthropist, and props to them. They really bought into AI and the social good being a really critical opportunity for the sector to start thinking through some of these critical questions as well. So they have asked us to take our paper and create a more digestible two pieces that are coming out as a series. And the first one was February 18th, and you can get that from the philanthropist. It's online. And then part 2 coming out March 18th, The Rise of the Good Machine, so the blueprint for action. The first one talks about the context, and the second one talks about the next steps. From there, next. Okay, so actually flip again. So just again, by way of talking about AI, and looking at your guys' experience, I don't think we need to spend too much time about this, other than saying that AI has actually been around for quite a long time, and I think what's different now though is how quickly it's being developed and innovated upon in ways that are kind of speeding up the velocity of its impacts as well. So by no means are we saying that we've fully achieved this kind of artificial general intelligence. The singularity isn't upon us. However, the last 100 years compared to the last 10 years, like, we can all agree that this is moving at a speed that's unprecedented, and hence James's point that this is the time to be having these conversations. It's not something we can put off for another 10 years. It'll be too late by then. So next slide, please. A little bit about the context of the fourth industrial revolution and AI's role within it. Again, this is not unprecedented that society undergoes these mass transformations, and we have kind of technology underpinning a lot of them as well in the first, second, and third previous industrial revolutions. Now, the trick with all of those from a social good perspective, and something that we're keenly aware of in our sector, is that each of them has had kind of plus and minuses when it comes to vulnerable populations and social impacts. And each of them have been shaped by power holders that are not necessarily paying attention to those that are kind of in the underclass or the lower classes or the marginal, the colonized, etc. So if we're really smart about this work, we need to be thinking about that right up front. The World Economic Forum does an excellent job looking at the key issues shaping the fourth industrial revolution, and I'm part of an experts network on this. So we get to watch how the sectors, how that big thinking around the fourth industrial revolution is being shaped worldwide, and what people are thinking about. So it's if you're really interested in that, I encourage you to get connected through the WEF and start following some of their work in this space, because it spans sectors from health and society to economic development and financial flows, etc. And the point is, it's like everything is getting impacted. So we would be remiss not to think about the social aspect of it, which unfortunately is always underrepresented in these discussions. Why should we care? I think you've heard why we think we need to care. Obviously, there's the aspect of this being already here, right? So we're all already experiencing AI in our daily lives, and this is happening with or without us. Netflix is another great example, and all the great suggestions it has for what you should, binge watch next. But at the same time, like we're also aided by the technology that has negative aspects as well in the collection of our data that I'm sure you're very familiar with when it comes to Facebook and the Cambridge Analytica, deep fake conversations. Again, these are things that are front page news right now, which beg us to think differently about how these are impacting the social world as well. So with this point, with the control of AI right now and big data as well, is particularly driven by the big nine. I believe there's 9 super tech companies that are controlling how AI gets used and developed. So even right there, it's already kind of creating a different class of capitalism as well that we haven't necessarily experienced in the past. So again, we hear all about how we need to get involved and to actively shape the public policy discourse on this issue. So from a democratic process perspective, it's quite critical, which also comes into play when we think about the social sector's role in AI and being drivers of change and equitable policy making when it comes to big data and the digital workforce, etc. So next slide, please. I think it's over back to you, James, to talk about.
Great, thanks, Alina. So I won't spend much time on this slide. It's fun to talk about over beers, but it's basically, we do outline, and in the philanthropist article as well, some sort of, we muse about 4 possible future scenarios, like going out decades, even into the next century. And these are an interesting mental exercise. But they're also important to think about in terms of the risks, right? So pick your percentage. I don't know if it's 25% for each scenario, but we pick 4 scenarios that say, well, either we won't actually get to a point where we have hugely advanced artificial general intelligence because of climate change or some other conflagration or disaster. We won't get to that point. So civilization could collapse. That's always a possibility, but we don't think so. But civilization might be replaced. This is kind of the Skynet scenario from the Terminator, right? This is what Elon Musk, Sam Harris, and others talk about with the rise of super intelligent machines. So Nick Bostrom's book, which has sometimes been compared with Rachel Carson's Silent Spring, it talks entirely about, well, we may actually be creating autonomous systems that ultimately see no use for us. The third scenario is around human zoos, or benign containment, as we call it, where the idea here is simply that machines are aware of the biases, the crueler tendencies of human beings, and will actually take steps to contain and circumscribe our power for our own good. It's kind of like if you look at the future of any other primate species, gorillas or orangutans, or take your pick, they're in our hands. Their future is entirely in our hands. So this scenario says it'll be a benign future, but we won't be able to touch anything, and we won't be able to ruin stuff, and it will be in in other beings' hands, mechanical beings' hands. And then the fourth one is really what we assume we're working towards, which is a kind of co-created future, where humans are at least in the co-pilot seat, if not the captain seat, where human values of democracy, rational compassion, are baked into algorithms, where we could see a scenario where homelessness is eliminated, where climate change is stopped, where life-extending treatments for countless diseases are created. So this cobotic future, if you like, how do we get there? How do we actually start to think about this in a productive way? So one of the things we note is that the most AI-proof jobs are actually those that require high levels of compassion or creativity, or ideally both competencies in tandem. So you think of caregivers, counselors, teachers, artists, dramatists, and so on. Those are not just AI-proof, they need to be AI ready. So Elizabeth Good Christofferson of the Rita Allen Foundation has a great quote here, which is basically, used poorly, there's no doubt that artificial intelligence will serve to automate bias, disconnection, rather than support community resiliency. So for the social sector, a values-driven, human-centered, inclusive process of development can help mitigate the ethical risks of developing artificial intelligence. But what is our blueprint for coexistence? Well, let's start with looking at some areas where there's actual innovations actually underway for some clues. So one of the big domains is in healthcare. And so there's a lot of vigorous AI research and development going on, particularly in diagnostics, where neural network technology has matched or exceeded the accuracy of specialists in detecting over 50 different eye disorders, skin cancer, pediatric diseases. Neil Jacobson, who's an AI health innovator, says that we will soon see an inflection point where doctors will feel it's a risk to not use machine learning and AI in their everyday practices, because they don't want to be called out for missing an important diagnostic signal. This is very, very close. This is not some theoretical far off future. So it will help analyze and synthesize complex data regarding symptoms, drug interactions, risk factors, having more of a patient-tailored or bespoke treatment regimen. It can certainly help with assistive devices to make them more effective, healthcare administration, and so on. There are many, many innovations, some of which we talk about in our writing. AI and environmental protection. So there's a McKinsey study that came out a couple of years ago that chronicled already 160 AI applications used across all 17 UN Sustainable Development Goals. We see a lot of really interesting combinations with drones, with remote sensing. So for example, in monitoring soil moisture and runoff, or identifying and catching poachers. Certainly in the development of clean tech, solar panels, batteries, materials, AI is already having a huge impact. AI and arts and creativity is another area. So at the Expressive Machinery Lab at Georgia Tech, they've developed a method called the collaborative movement improvisation, which is actually a robot that learns from human dance partners how to dance. But we've seen the use of AI in creative writing, in everything from painting and photography to the development of a novel, in fact. These advances tend to democratize, decentralize, and dematerialize production so that we can have what are called, well, there's a quote from Taiichi Fukuyama, who says he created something called the Amadeus Code. And he says, when you think about it, all major technological advances have always been seen as challenges initially to artistic frontiers, but in fact, they've expanded artistic frontiers. One really interesting one is called Augur out of Stanford. And what that's doing is it's looking at a giant corpus of fictional works by English language authors. in order to learn how human behavior and emotional responses happen, and to really understand the breadth of the human condition, human life. So I think we're on the precipice of a renaissance potentially in the arts. AI in education, it's another big area. Northeastern University President Joseph Ayan argues in a book called Robot Proof, Higher Education in the Age of Artificial Intelligence, that education must not simply be to understand how we can use better data in machine learning, but also to fill the needs of society that even the most advanced AI agent cannot. So he talks a bit about, well, how do you become robot proof? Not just producing a bunch of people who can code. That's only 1 to 3% of the population. We need people who have philosophy degrees and who can apply that into a kind of machine learning or tech environment. And so one of the quotes here, change is the only constant. From the student perspective, they are already becoming inundated with super intelligent machines, algorithms that can read their moods. They're seeing their jobs remolded. And so we are seeing the reimagining of education in pretty profound ways. Those who champion the liberal arts, I think, may be on the cusp of a new golden age. It's already disrupting the factory model of education. And then in research, we're seeing really amazing things. We've seen AI actually generate academic papers more as a kind of experiment to show up some of the shallowness of predatory journals or academic conferences that have very low submission standards. So you've seen AI generated papers, but you also see the start of AI meta-analyses of actual peer-reviewed works. So here's one produced in Germany on lithium-ion batteries. It's a serious meta-analysis of 53,000 peer-reviewed papers into a 180-page summary of what we know about lithium-ion batteries. That's real, that's today. There are many other potential applications. Models in the US identifying homeless persons who are likely to become high-cost users of public services. Other applications looking at transit access, high-cost users of education, racial profiling and abuses of police power. We've seen AI used in satellite imagery to identify wealthy and poor regions in Africa at a much finer grain than national accounts or censuses can provide. We've looked at predictive analytics in use for predicting riots or lynchings or mob violence in Liberia. All kinds of really cutting edge things. Predicting suicidal behavior, used in analyzing counseling, for people contemplating suicide, for example. So I'll stop there. I'll move it over to Alina.
Yeah, thanks. So on this, having seen what's all happening in various other sectors, including our own, the question becomes, what now? How do we prepare? So we draw on philanthropy futurist and head of the Stanford Center for Philanthropy and Civil Society, and Lucy asks, how might a revisioning of civil society proceed when the starting assumption is that our individual and collective dependence on digital infrastructure will continue and get more complicated? The point being that some of the leaders in our sector are similarly probing these questions as well. In our article, we talk about this further, and it's almost like we're at this crossroads that you can see there. And we reflect on the fact that in past generations and past industrial revolutions, we haven't always done a very good job as a social sector to inform where this direction is going to lead in terms of technological advancements and their impact on society. And we have an opportunity now to be active agents within this change process, but we need to make that decision and actually take action in this. And again, one of our quotes is that we can't, sorry, flip back to the other one, James, because I love this quote. I think it was you who wrote it, not me, but you said, we can't afford to be the cleanup crew of the fourth industrial revolution, which, let's be honest, the charitable sector has become consecutively as these previous other generations have not paid attention to marginalized groups and have created wider and wider chasms in society. So we can move to the next one now. Back to the big nine, so I guess it was the nine, what can we do and what can we think about when we have opportunities to influence public policy as civil society and social good actors, to this idea of an AI comment. So we can't just expect technology to be good. We actually have to be active and insist on the social good being part of the fabric that's shaping where technology goes as well. So this is, again, not a coincidence. We need to have an active leadership role to shape this direction, and we can't let industry and actually determine where this goes without civil society and that perspective being brought in. We do have some, obviously, interest from our sector to get further and further involved in this work. So there's some examples that you can see there, including Open North or Data for Good, of efforts to get us active in this space. So there's some encouragement there. However, compared to other sectors that James was referencing, from our review, we see a considerable gap when it comes to the social good being active leaders in the AI space, and we think that's something that we need to poke leaders to become much more aware of and active in. So even for my conversations at the federal level around homelessness policy and homelessness data, when I bring up AI and needing to think about big data, they literally laugh at me, which is insane to me, that in a conversation about homelessness and data, we wouldn't be talking about AI. So we do have to do some work in terms of putting this on the agenda. We also need to be thinking about how we future-proof our sector and our workforce in the social space. So tech and data literacy, we have school systems that are shifting how they do their work, but has our sector been thinking about what this means in terms of their workflows and their use of data in day-to-day operations, et cetera? I would say, again, whereas some kind of equivalents that we have in the private sector leverage data to deliver social services through the privatized modes that are digitally accessible, we haven't even broached the virtual service delivery at all, and we haven't even thought much about what data and tech literacy means when it comes to the current social worker workforce either. So we need to pay attention to this, and it doesn't mean that we all become robot builders or coders, but we do need to have a new level of data literacy. That's currently not the case. We spoke about the deep fake and fake news, et cetera. That also means that we need to have a different ability to be critical and analyze what's coming at us from this hyper citizenship perspective that we talk about. So this idea that everybody or all tech is evil is not going to be a useful perspective. On the other hand, how do we discern what's real and what isn't in the current context? And all of these pieces are relevant because they all influence whether we're working in government and social policy or whether we're delivering services on the ground. This is all going to have an impact on our clients and our processes as well. And the other point too is that we have an opportunity as social sector leaders to actually influence the direction of this fourth industrial revolution, because we are paying attention to the social social issues as well. We have the ability to be creative, to bring that collective imagination, the collective impact model to the tech development space as well. We don't want the tech to be developed without us influencing it either. Now on this, and it's a bit of a double-edged sword for us, is that we're sometimes, the social sector is sometimes the last ones to wake up to some of these changes as well. So it's unfortunate that, you know, we are on the one hand the ones paying attention to social issues, but on the other hand really slow on tech innovation, and we can't have that at this point in our development. So that's something that we're going to need to work on to advance further as well. I think it's back to you. Oh no, I think one more on this. Yeah, next one. I love this one because our mission is to be positive disruptors, but it's, you know, to what end, right? It's disruption, and what replaces the disruption. We need to also be co-creating this future state after we've shaken up the status quo. Both James and I were involved in this series, the Disrupting the Good, that talks about how the social innovation space is changing, and we both talked about the need to become much more agile and nimble in our work, and to have that adaptive capacity to change very, very quickly. And while in the tech sector, this is just how things are done to survive, in our world, the charitable model, you can see there, it's been around for, I mean, we can trace it back to Greco-Roman times and even beyond that. So the charity model has been around a very, very long time, and now it's becoming increasingly disrupted as well. So we're going to need to become much more adaptive in our leadership styles and in the way that we train the workforce and adapt to emerging needs in a much quicker turnaround. On this, if you were wondering whether this is a public policy issue at this point, we would say that it absolutely is becoming an investment focus for government. We have the Liberal government federally starting to invest heavily in AI development and in AI superclusters that are emerging in key parts of the country, including Edmonton, closer to home or home to some of you on the call as well. Windsor is another supercluster that's doing very interesting work in the social good and AI space to watch out for. So lots is starting to emerge. So in other words, we need to get ourselves engaged in some of these superclusters and ensure that tech development has a social lens to it, and that we're active participants in its co-development as well.
So Canada is getting a reputation for being quite a leader in AI science and tech innovation, and I would add, University of Alberta is right at the forefront of that. At the same time, Canada also has a reputation, perhaps less well known, around social innovation. And I would say, Edmonton has been referred to as the Silicon Valley of social innovation by some. So the trouble is, those worlds aren't talking to each other, hardly at all. They're working in splendid isolation. And so, again, Lucy Bernholtz has this wonderful quote where she says, there's no clean room for social innovation. It takes place in the inequitable, unfair, discriminatory world of real people. So no algorithm, machine learning application, or policy innovation on its own will counter the system, and it's past time to keep pretending they will. So what's behind that? She's saying, let's not leave it up to people who want to do good, but who solely rely on a technical expertise, a hackathon, an app, etc., to solve our social problems. It's well past time to stop pretending that in itself will work. To use a historical analogy, there's a picture of Jane Jacobs here, and it's prescient because we actually saw a bit of a parallel when you look at the development of post-war cities and how architects, transportation engineers, generally white males in expert roles, said, leave it to us. We're going to build more humane cities. And of course, the result is intensifying urban violence and decay, They ignored the nuances of city life at a neighborhood level. They had blind spots around race and ethnocultural diversity, little regard for the ecological footprint of their creations. And so how do we channel Jane Jacobs' spirit to bring empirically informed expert insight with citizen advocacy and experience? So how inclusive are our high-tech hackathons, right? Where are the voices across the disciplines? So we can look, thankfully, to some of the entities that are already out there. We talked about some of the existential risk type entities that are out there, but there's also a small but growing number of either university-based or independent think tanks, if you like, looking at this integration of social good and AI. One worth pointing out is the USC Center for Artificial Intelligence in Society, University of Southern California, which is run by a social work professor, but employs healthcare practitioners, policy analysts, social sector thinkers and doers, alongside tech engineers and developers. Very cool model. There is also an AI for Good Global Summit these days, and X Prize is getting involved. There are foundations that are partnering with some of the large tech companies, like there's a partnership between National Geographic and IBM or Google and the Leonardo DiCaprio Foundation. And so that's encouraging to see. And again, in Canada, it's a fairly bleak but changing for the better landscape around AI and social good. So for example, the Schwartz Reisman Innovation Center at the U of T promises to look into this intersection of socially responsible biomedicine and AI. There's some interesting work at the University of Guelph and Laval. But again, the question for me is what's happening in Alberta? And the answer appears to be not much, but I'm open to being corrected on that. So just to close with a quote from our report, we, channeling Nick Bostrom again, who said, this is really humanity's last invention. So we better take pains to make sure that this invention is one we got right? So millennia from now, the people who look back and note that the one thing that mattered, we actually did get right. So this is a pretty important thing to be talking about, we think. So please, any questions or challenges or provocations, most welcome.
Naomi, did you want to open up the questions, or did you want us to take a stab at things?
Yeah, this is, so thank you very much, James and Alina, and the floor is open. So if anyone wants to pop a question in the chat or just unmute yourself, feel free to do so. I do see Wade has shared a link in the chat. Thank you for that. And I don't know if you want to speak any more to what that is or how you see that relating to the topic.
So you may have to unmute if...
Yeah. Hey, if there's no questions, it means we... Oh.
It was sent without much context.
Sent without much context. Yeah, Wade, do you wanna take a stab at kind of giving us a gist of the piece that you shared? Lethal autonomous weapons pledge. Okay. I'm guessing I can tell where that might be going, but. Or any questions from anyone? Any innovations that you might be working on that are using AI in the social good space? Please share those as well. My head is spinning. Thanks for this eye-opening overview of the vast potential, what's currently happening with post-secondary institutions in Alberta to future-proof our students. Good questions. Me and James both have kids, and we don't even know if we're going to send them to university right now. that's how disruptive this space has become, right? Yeah, I don't know, James, did you want to take a stab at this?
Yeah, I mean, it's great. So what I see happening, and this is highly anecdotal, and so I have a daughter who's in grade 5, and it really does depend on the teacher, of course, but what I see is like absolute level of comfort with tech that I certainly didn't have when I was that age, and it's ubiquitous. It's so much so, I mean, my daughter had a friend in her class who taught her how to hack into the City of Calgary website. So this is out there, and you know, at the same time where Greta Thunberg is coming to town, and there are you know, the access and ease of and ubiquity of social issues coming to the fore. You know, we've had discussions about the Wet'suwet'en issue and pipelines, and you know, there's much more social awareness among young people, and we, of course, see 20-somethings coming into university routinely. I would say there's a lot of generalized social awareness and a very strong interest in doing good, and doing good through tech, because a lot of people will go to tech right away. That doesn't translate into students saying, well, therefore I should be working in the nonprofit sector, or therefore you know, I have to understand public policy. There's actually, I think, we're failing to have a proper kind of civic literacy, and that's even basic civic literacy, like how does government work? But what we're advocating for, and we're not seeing until maybe you get to university, and maybe you pick the right selection of liberal arts courses, and maybe figure out a great way to integrate it. But we're not seeing that hyper citizenship that we spoke about, that notion of, well, how do you detect fake news from real news, real science from fake science? How do you talk to people who fundamentally disagree with you? How do you remove or detect in our day-to-day speech and dialogue things that are actually meme generated or bot generated? I mean, most of the Wexit stuff actually is generated out of basically a fake news mill in St. Petersburg, Russia. I mean, we should be ashamed of ourselves for even like going down that path, but we're not, because we assume that, well, that's the proxy for community. That's what people are talking about. But so those are really, really important skills that we need to get on top of.
Yeah. So it's how do we unleash those that are tech savvy and tech driven to have social consciousness and critical social critical thinking skills, so that we can leverage that tech innovation to do good. So with the deep fakes, can you imagine having kind of our most creative minds detecting and staying ahead of any of those bots, and actually kind of improving kind of the democratic process, rather than, you know, being victims to it? And when we did the review, and some of you are asking whether are there certain sectors that are better than others, and you know, we talked about the health sector being quite ahead, and some countries actually have AI-driven health transformation strategies. So in particular, the NHS in Britain is, right, the Human Genome Project is another one around genetic, gene editing, etc. But all of these are not necessarily socially driven. They're still kind of government and corporate driven as well. So, you know, our perspective is that there was kind of a grassroots awareness of these pieces, and civil society as it exists today was able to kind of foster that through a collective impact lens, and we would have a much better chance of creating awareness in all of these pockets around the social good, because it's not just health and justice and education on their own. They are all part of an ecosystem anyways. and that we need to insert ourselves into and have this hyper citizenship be manifested and social consciousness be manifested. But I think with this new generation, back to James's point, is, you know, they have an expectation to be socially engaged, so that's a bonus. And they, like my kids, already code, you know, and they're already there. So it's just it's now part of play and imagination, which is different, and it's part of their social interaction. Now, the point about future-proofing them, that's the billion-dollar question, probably, that governments are struggling with. I wrote a paper on the impact of AI on the oil and gas sector, and how, on the one hand, through the sustainability work, we're doing fantastic work in getting more and more efficient, but we're therefore creating energy at bottom price. We're going to have kind of a very, very cheap energy that's going to displace the need for human-based production. And so now you're creating this unemployment as well. So on the one hand, we're greening, but on the other hand, there's a social ill that we're also creating. So the green and social aren't necessarily the same thing either. The point being is we need to be in all those conversations to ensure that lens is applied. All right, let's see what other pieces are here. Yeah, James, do you want to read some of these out?
I'm looking, it looks like you've responded well to Therese's question there already. And Troy, you highlighted an example of work that you're doing, which is great. I'm sure all of us would love to connect with you more around that, and highlighted Alina's point on healthcare being one of the areas that's further ahead there. Walter, did you have a question you wanted to share? I think we might.
Yes, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
So,
yay. Hi, Walter.
Yeah, it's very stimulating listening in. I detected a bit of a conundrum, I guess. On the one hand, and I guess it's about the leadership and leadership approach. On the one hand, the need to be inclusive and decentralized and thoughtful and so forth. And on the other hand, to be quick and nimble and respond quickly to how this world is changing. And, you know, the whatever you call it, $64 million question is, how do you do both at the same time? You know, quick and nimble usually excludes inclusiveness and thoughtfulness and planful, or whatever you want to call it there.
Yeah, that's a great insight, really great insight. I mean, I think one of the answers is so Alina mentioned that, you know, kids today are really comfortable coding. One of the reasons it's comfortable to code is because it's a lot easier to code. Anyone can learn coding really quickly, but that was not the case if you go back 20 years ago. We now have the privilege of building, you know, standing on the shoulders of giants with 7 or 8 layers of language abstraction and language simplification, so that we're a long way from coding ones and zeros, right? We're actually coding in an interface that's much more intuitive, that makes a lot of sense. And so that may be a bit of a parallel for thinking about inclusivity as well, right? So we have, when you look at the advanced software that's out there, like Ethelo or, oh gosh, I forget some of the names of these softwares, but they enable, for example, participatory budgeting across thousands of users and millions of data points. And in a way, some of this technology, like being skilled up on some of the technology, actually will help us with the inclusivity piece. Not in all cases. There's still a role for deep listening and really understanding cultural contexts and so on. But I mean, some of this is as simple as we just need to get a heck of a lot better in inviting more people into the right rooms. And that crosses gender, that crosses age, that crosses culture. And so some of it isn't necessarily going to slow us up. It can be done without, I mean, it's still going to be a trade-off to some extent. You know, moving quickly and breaking stuff is not what we want to do. That's the Zuckerberg credo. But at the same time, we don't want to dwell forever in ongoing perpetual loops of dialogue that don't lead us anywhere. And that if you're in a room where you've had that same conversation for years, find a different room. You know, we need to move on.
Mm-hmm.
So there's no simple answer to that. I mean, it's a great question. It's a great conundrum, but I think we just need to be aware of that.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Thanks, James. That's great.
Thanks for that question, Walter. I think, yeah, many of these really interesting tensions show up as we look at this interface between AI and the social good sector as well. And I'm sorry to have to cut this conversation short, but it is 1 o'clock. Thank you so much, Alina and James, for this really engaging presentation. And I think just a super helpful overview of why these two sectors and areas should be paying more close attention to each other. I hope it will foster some more conversation. I see a lot of links and examples and email addresses being shared in the chat, and we will share that all out. So please do feel free to either pop it in the chat before you leave or send us a quick email to the same. You can find our address on abseconnect.ca. And we'll send out a follow-up email early next week with the recording of this session, all of the different links and resources mentioned by James and Alina, and that you're sharing out as well.
Marvelous.
Awesome.
Thanks so much for hosting.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you so much. Look forward to connecting with everyone.
Thanks so
Thanks,
much.
you guys.